Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. We're the weekly radio news magazine put together by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, online at virginiainstitute.org, so you can hear the reality past the rhetoric. When the megaphones go off, what's left behind, the governing, and what actually is real versus hair on fire name calling, even from offices as high as the President of the United States. Our first guest is one of our favorites from the Heritage Foundation. He is their go-to expert when it comes to election integrity. And, you know, Hans von Spakovsky, welcome back to the show. I remember when we used to have to sort of explain why this was an important thing to people. I don't think we need to explain it nearly as much as we used to. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. And boy, Joe, are you right? The whole issue of election integrity is now number one in the conscience of the public, and even state legislators who are working on this too.
I got an email from a listener over this past weekend. I thought it was seminal. It said, "Virtue signaling has replaced baseball as the nation's pastime." It
is.
With this Atlanta issue, and I want to talk more about H.R. 1 as well, because it's still bubbling in the Senate, and I worry that some of this stuff is designed to weaken the resolve of some of the Republican members of the Senate. But when you look at what Major League Baseball and Delta and Coca-Cola and all these organizations have done off of something that even the Washington Post had to say was patently and obviously a lie. They gave the president 5 Pinocchios for this, yet somehow Major League Baseball said, well, it just being out there is good enough to change the All-Star game. Delta Airlines, who's got Chinese nationals, I think they're the number one American carrier into Beijing, but they're somehow offended by it. Take us into the reality. Joe Biden must have just gotten told some talking point about the Georgia bill and just went off on a riff about it, which he's been wanting to do most of his life. Get us some of the realities of what Georgia's doing, and maybe baseball pulling out the All-Star game can help us make the case.
Oh, I think it does. And by the way, I don't know if you just saw the news, but baseball just signed a contract with one of China's largest tech companies, which is backed by the Communist Party, so they can telecast their games in China and elsewhere. So they don't mind doing deals that bring them lots of dollars with a totalitarian dictatorship, but a democratically enacted election reform bill in Georgia, no, that causes them problems. But yeah, all of these lies that were out there about the Georgia election reform bill were things saying that, it restricts voting, it cuts the voting time, the time the polls are open, all of which is just simply untrue. And one of the biggest things they objected to was the fact that, Georgia's had a voter ID law, actually a very good one, that requires a government-issued photo ID. It's been in place for more than a decade, with no problems of any kind. In fact, the lawsuits filed against it failed because the plaintiffs in the case, the ACLU and Common Cause, the judge commented on the fact they couldn't find a single witness who'd be unable to vote because of the law. So one of the things they did with this reform bill was that law, it was a good law, but it only extended to in-person voting. And so they have changed that so that now it applies to absentee balloting also. And that, it makes perfect sense. It's easy to comply with. And in fact, the language that the legislature used for that extension of the voter ID requirement to absentee ballots, they actually got it from federal law. They got it from the Help America Vote Act, which, guess what? Senator Joe Biden voted to approve that back in 2002.
Oh my goodness, that's the amazing part of this is there are so many members of that political party that have circled all the way back around on themselves on this issue. Even the former governor of Georgia, not a Republican, Jimmy Carter, saying that all the things that are in this Georgia bill are good. As a matter of fact, some of the things in the Georgia bill, I think Jimmy Carter said you shouldn't do, but Georgia said we'll come up with a way, like the vote drop boxes can only be at polling places. But there are a lot of people say you shouldn't have them even there because they're not necessarily well watched or attended. But I guess as long as they attend the vote counting.
Yeah, look, that's one of the things that was false that was being said about this bill. They were saying, oh, they're somehow going to outlaw drop boxes. Well, drop boxes weren't even allowed in Georgia prior to this law. And in fact, what they said was, okay, well, you can have drop boxes, but they have to be in secured. Then where are secured settings? Well, polling places. That's a lot smarter than putting them out on the street where they are unsecured, unmonitored, unsurveilled, and ballots can be stolen. The boxes can be burned. I mean, all kinds of things could happen to them. And Georgia simply said, okay, well, we're going to allow drop boxes, but only in a secured setting.
Let's talk about the security, because one of the things that happened here in the Commonwealth of Virginia is you had election season, 45 days of voting. But unlike places like Pennsylvania, where the absentee votes just came in and sat in a bin and didn't get counted until the election night, when poll watchers could have been there when everyone was prepared for it, registrars across the Commonwealth for 45 days were counting votes. And the argument is, well, nobody stopped a Republican from being in there to watch. But I mean, can it even be reasonable to assume, whether it be a Republican or a Democrat, that you could have a poll watcher just at every registrar's office for 45 days on the odd chance that a half a dozen mail-in ballots show up?
No, it's not. And in fact, look, that's one of the whole problems with early voting. And I really don't understand why critics are getting so upset about states that either don't have early voting or don't want as much early voting. We never had early voting in this country until the late 1980s when they first started being put in, and we didn't have a problem getting to the polls and voting. And what does early voting do? One, it ruins the transparency of the election process because it makes it very hard, as you say, for it to have observers there to watch things, which is a fundamental requirement of elections, that kind of transparency. But look, I don't think voters think about the fact that if they vote 45 days before an election, if something happens, if news comes out about a candidate as important to their vote, they can't change their vote. It's too late to do anything about it.
Right. Well, so it looks like the Georgia governor is steadfast in this.
Yeah.
And Governor Kemp has been a controversial figure because it was portrayed, and I wonder sometimes with the veracity, that he and the president were at loggerheads all the time, which, as with many things President Trump said, were not necessarily the words he used, but what the media implied were words in between the lines, I guess. So he's been in this crosshair of, Republicans mad at him, Democrats mad at him. Can he make it through this and keep this law in place?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the law passed the General Assembly in Virginia. Kemp signed it into law. What has already happened is, of course, left-wing advocacy groups are going to sue and target it and try to get it thrown out the same way they targeted the voter ID law that the state passed, more than a decade ago. They were unsuccessful in their challenge, but all of that depends on having a strong attorney general who is willing to fight hard to keep the law in place and isn't going to just surrender and give in the way, for example, the attorney general of Virginia has.
Right.
In what we would call collusive lawsuits filed by the left against things like the state's voter ID law.
Speak to the judicial side of this, because it's also going to require a judge that doesn't want to, I don't know, whether make law on his or her own from the bench, legislate from the bench, whatever you want to call it. What if, as we've seen all too frequently, a lot of conservatives don't hold faith that our judicial system, when faced with a decision like this, will make the right constitutional one, but will make the more popular one that will keep them from having their home address put up on every website out there?
Well, in fact, that is a realistic fear. And a lot will depend, for example, in the Georgia case, on which federal district court judge the case is assigned to. Probably one of the worst things that could happen is, I don't know if you realize this, but, Nina Totenberg, the Supreme Court reporter for public radio, NPR, her sister is a federal judge down in Georgia and is one of the most liberal left-wing judges you could possibly imagine. And it would be a disaster for Georgia if this case got assigned to her, because she's not going to care what the law says, what the Constitution says. She's going to want to do what the left wants her to do on the case. All we can hope for is that even if that happens, we'll get the right decision out of the Court of Appeals and hopefully eventually from the U.S. Supreme Court. And don't forget, for example, in 2008, the Supreme Court upheld Indiana's voter ID law, and that was a great decision. And hopefully, we'll get good decisions like that again.
Hans von Spakovsky is on with us from the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org, specialist in election integrity. I'm going to pivot now, Hans. We've talked about the Georgia law. I worry that the maelstrom that surrounds the mischaracterization of this Georgia law is going to have an impact on some of the, I'll call them moderate Republican senators that might allow some abomination like H.R. 1 to go through under the premise of look at the bollocks that they're making of everything. We need a federal guideline. Is that a fair concern?
Oh, it is. And I will tell you that I think, in fact, that was intentionally done by the left. Keep in mind, H.R. 1, which is the bill we talked about before, which is a complete federal takeover of the election process, all of the provisions in there have been pushed forward and were written by left-wing advocacy groups who've been pushing these concepts and proposals for years. And I think they are the ones, probably, that were circulating talking points about the Georgia law that were simply untrue, because we kept hearing, it was weird how we kept hearing the same things coming out of voices on the left, like the president, all making the same mistaken claims about it. So I think that was an organized effort. And
interesting.
And I think it was intentional, for exactly what you said, to shore up support for H.R. 1 to overcome this supposedly horrible Georgia reform bill.
There's an obscure story out of Louisiana that I have a lot of listeners find humor in. I'm much more concerned about, because it's about a highway that they want to tear up because of its racial background. The racist highway isn't named after a Civil War general, but it was built through a predominantly poor black neighborhood. And I've heard several commentators say, well, of course, that's usually what happens. That's how urban renewal happens, because you can get public support for it. I want people to stop making that case for it, because I think that plays, again, another hand into the H.R. 1 advocates who say, see, that's why we need to get campaign finance out of the hands of the well-heeled, wealthy neighborhoods that will keep a highway project out of their backyard. Am I seeing too many shadows, Hans? Talk me off the ledge if I am.
No, I can't talk you off the ledge. Although that is just an absurd claim, because I live very close to Interstate 66, which goes from Washington into Western Virginia, and Interstate 66 was not exactly built through poor neighborhoods. It was built through very wealthy and well-off neighborhoods.
This is true.
Falls Church and places like that. So this idea that highways are only built through areas where the poor live, I mean, come on. That's the kind of ridiculous claim we're getting all the time.
But again, I think it feeds into their idea that we need a federal bag of money that will go to the candidates that we've chosen to run for the seats that we've chosen, and it becomes almost kabuki theater after that. And that's one of the most frightening parts of H.R. 1, isn't it, Hans, that it creates this idea that, we've finally eliminated all the dark money and the PACs will be, no more PAC ads and attack ads because you'll just get, this will be your allotment for your campaign if we approve you from the government. And so the government, the Congress, will approve of people who get to run for Congress.
Yeah, in fact, someone sent me a link to a Zoom virtual meeting that Sheldon Whitehouse, as you know, the senator from Rhode Island, who's a chief sponsor of all this, was giving to these Democratic activist groups. And he basically said that the purpose of H.R. 1, particularly the changes to campaign finance rules, are intended to silence and get rid of criticism by what he called dark money. Dark money is basically any group of citizens or organizations that criticize him or don't like policies put forward by the left. And he admitted that that's really the purpose of the bill, is to silence opposition.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the problem, is that we have Supreme Court rulings about speech. It becomes a case where, as we saw, I think it was Chris Horner, the author of so many climate books, discovered that Michael Bloomberg was funding adjunct attorney general assistant attorney generals working on tracking down companies that were funding climate deniers, like E&E Legal or Heritage. Or, you gave money to them. Oh, really? Well, it's IRS audit. I don't know how many different ways they can weaponize the law against companies silencing speech. But even the implication of it, Hans, I worry, will silence speech, saying I better go along with them or it could get a whole lot worse for me.
Oh, I think that's right. And in fact, I think that's behind what has happened with all the corporations like Delta and Coca-Cola and others criticizing the Georgia reform bill when it was very clear they didn't even know what was in it, because they are playing to the woke culture and are afraid of everything from boycotts to the Biden administration using its powers at the IRS and elsewhere to go after them if they don't.
Is it somewhat of a political Rubicon to cross that, though, Hans? Because I'm hearing from a lot of Democrats that are a little uncomfortable with the way their political party is behaving this time around in majority.
Well, I hope that's true, but that hasn't always stopped them in the past. I mean, again, we keep going back to voter ID, but that's probably the best example of this. Look, there have been all these recent polls out showing that voter ID is overwhelmingly supported by Americans. Mm-hmm. And that includes Democrats. It includes Black Americans. It includes people who are the main constituency of the Democratic Party. And yet look at the way it's attacked by Democratic elected officials, by left-wing advocacy groups like the NAACP and the ACLU and others. It's totally divorced from what their constituents think about it, but that doesn't stop them from doing it.
Well, wasn't the whole point of Motor Voter, one of the highlights of the Clinton years, the point that people were getting their IDs at the DMV anyway, that if we made it easier to do that, then you could just register to vote while you were getting your photo ID card. So technically they're fighting something that Bill Clinton supported. Well, yes. No, that's absolutely true. And by the way, you mentioned Jimmy Carter, former Democratic president. I mean, in fact, he formed a commission on federal election reform that in 2005 issued a report that recommended voter ID throughout the country. Well, that's it. That's the thing is his report, Jim Baker's report, actually suggests tougher regulations than Georgia has right now. Yeah, that's exactly right. But it shows you how much things have changed, because back then it was a bipartisan commission. The members of the commission, Democrats and Republicans, pretty much agreed with that. Today,
with rare exceptions, you cannot find a single Democratic elected official anywhere in the country that will go against what the woke culture is saying has to be done with elections.
How do we, in this is esoteric election thought, Hans, and maybe you've had thoughts about this, ruminations, perhaps not wheelhouse expertise, but you do study elections and election integrity. Have we gotten to a place where the two political parties have grown so powerful that they're almost, and I've referred to them on occasion, sometimes with tongue-in-cheek, as the unconstitutional fourth and fifth branches of our government, and that dissent means dismissal, and so a Joe Manchin or a Mitt Romney can't dissent, otherwise they will be ousted from the party and as an outcast?
Well, I certainly think that's true on the left side of the political aisle. I don't think it's as much true on the right side of the political aisle, because I actually think folks on the right side are more independent-minded and don't feel like they always have to follow the party line. That is not true on the left side. In fact, I spoke to a Secretary of State, who I won't identify, who told me that he has gotten calls from Democratic registrars, county registrars, who have told him they think H.R. 1 is a horrible bill, but they can't say so publicly, because if they did, the entire might of the Democratic Party would descend on them, and that tells you how afraid they are of dissenting from whatever the chosen view is of the Democratic Party, for example, on issues like H.R. 1.
I think I have an answer, Hans. We have all those registrars go to the southern border, cross over into Mexico quietly, and then come to the United States seeking asylum. Once they've got asylum, then they're protected, right? Can we get them some protection in the asylum laws? It's amazing. Or maybe whistleblower laws. Last day, to leave you with a smile, though, Hans von Spakovsky, heritage.org. This one should say all you need to know is Delta, complains about Georgia's voting laws, and Major League Baseball pulls out its All-Star game. Remember what it is you have to show to pick up your tickets at the will call box at a baseball stadium, right, or your tickets at Reagan International Airport, right?
Yeah, that shows what total and complete hypocrites they really are.
Hans, I hope our words are getting through to people who are trying to say what has happened to my party. It wasn't nearly this crazy. It's almost back into the Will Rogers days. But I don't know if it gets worse before it gets better, but I'm glad we have folks like you around to help us hang on to the reins a little bit.
Well, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it. I always enjoy talking to you.
And we'll be right back with more of Freedom and Prosperity Radio.